All right, let's talk about something that sounds a little like old school loan sharking. You know, the kind of operation you'd find in a shady back alley. But what if I told you it's not happening in the shadows of the city, it's happening in the gleaming towers of Wall Street? It's a system that's been quietly reshaping our entire economy, and it all kicks off with a number that is, well, it's just staggering.
$2 trillion. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. What on earth is worth that much? That right there is the size of the private credit market, an empire that has absolutely exploded. And it's done it almost completely out of the public eye, operating in the shadows of the banking system that, we all think we understand. So what is this shadow empire anyway? How did it become this secret financial weapon used in some of the biggest corporate deals on the planet? Let's peel back the curtain.
This quote from one of our sources really just nails it, doesn't it? Private credit is all about providing fast cash to companies that either can't get a loan from a regular bank or, frankly, just don't want to deal with one. But as we're about to find out, all that speed and convenience, it comes with some pretty serious and very hidden risks.
Okay, so we know what it is, kinda, but how does a $2 trillion market just appear out of nowhere? Well, to get that, we actually have to rewind the clock to the last time the global economy was teetering right on the edge of collapse. Remember 2008? After that whole financial crisis, a bunch of new rules came in that made it way harder for banks to make risky loans. Now, this was a massive problem for private equity firms, because they need huge amounts of debt to do their thing, buying companies. All of a sudden, there was this giant vacuum in the market, and you guessed it, private credit came rushing in to fill that void. And you can see exactly why it was so tempting. For the companies borrowing the money, private credit is way faster. There's way less red tape than you'd get with a bank. And for the investors, it promised these incredible returns. On the surface, it looked like a perfect win-win, right? It was funding all these deals for companies that were maybe too small or already had too much debt for the big traditional banks to touch. But this is where the story starts to take a bit of a darker turn. Because when you're operating in the shadows and you don't have to play by the same rules as everybody else, well, you create the perfect breeding ground for some really serious conflicts of interest. That is the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? Because get this, the biggest players in private equity are also now the biggest players in private credit. So let's just walk through how a typical deal really works. Okay, so picture this. You've got a giant private equity fund. They want to buy a company, and they're going to use a ton of borrowed money to do it. Pretty standard stuff. But where do they get that massive loan? Right here. They get the loan from a private credit fund that's owned by the exact same parent company. The firm is, for all intents and purposes, lending money to itself. And this, right here, is the absolute crux of the issue. When the buyer and the lender are basically the same entity, all the normal rules of negotiation just go right out the window. Sure, on paper, they're separate funds with different investors, but in reality, the very same people are sitting on both sides of the table. They're writing their own rules. So how do they bend those rules? Well, with this clever little accounting trick. It's called payment in kind interest, or PIK for short. And it's a way to make it look like a company is perfectly healthy, even when it's actually drowning in debt. So here's how it works. Imagine a company can't make its interest payment for the month. Instead of defaulting, which would look really bad, the lender just says, hey, don't worry about it. We'll just add the interest you owe back onto the total loan amount. So the debt gets bigger. And the next year, interest is charged on that new, larger amount. It's literally a snowball of debt rolling downhill in the dark, all while on the surface, everything looks just fine. And what you get is this: zombie companies. These are firms that are so choked with debt, they can't possibly innovate, they can't grow. They basically exist for one reason, and one reason only, to be kept technically alive so the private credit funds can keep collecting those sweet, sweet management fees. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Okay, this is all just a bunch of Wall Street insiders playing games with each other's money. But here's the kicker. The money that's fueling this entire system, well, there's a pretty good chance it's yours. So where is all this cash coming from? It's not just a handful of billionaires. We're talking about the pension funds that teachers and firefighters are counting on for retirement. We're talking about the insurance companies you pay your premium to every single month. University endowments. These are all funds that are desperate for higher returns, and private credit is promising them the moon. And that hunt for bigger and bigger returns?
Well, it has very, very real consequences for all of us on Main Street. When these companies loaded up with all that debt get into trouble, what's the first thing to go? Jobs. We've seen it in healthcare, where private equity ownership often means higher prices for patients. We're seeing it in housing, as these firms buy up entire neighborhoods of homes and jack up the rents. And that's not just a statistic. 33,000, that is the number of people who lost their jobs literally overnight when Toys R Us finally collapsed. That company was being forced to pay $400 million a year in interest alone. It was a burden no company could possibly sustain. So this all leads us to the big, scary question. Can this actually last? We've got a $2 trillion industry built on incredibly complex debt, operating with very little oversight, and it's all being fueled by our retirement money. What happens if the economy takes a real nosedive? This quote just perfectly captures the danger. Leverage, that's just a fancy word for borrowing massive amounts of money, is the very thing that made private credit so insanely profitable during the good times. But it's a double-edged sword. In the bad times, it can become absolutely catastrophic. All those zombie companies could finally collapse, all at once, sending shockwaves through the entire financial system.
You'd think regulators would be all over this, right? But they've been really slow to catch up. And, it's pretty hard to enforce tough rules when the industry's top lobbyists are people who used to be the government officials in charge of regulating them. It's the classic Washington revolving door.
In a way, we've seen this movie before. Over a century ago, one man, J.P. Morgan, had such a tight grip on the nation's credit that the U.S. government literally had to go to him for a bailout. Today, it's not one man. It's a small circle of giant, faceless asset management firms that control the flow of money. And that leaves us with the final, pretty unsettling question. It feels like history is repeating itself, but with a few critical differences. Today, the money moves at the speed of light. The financial system is global, and the oversight is far, far weaker. So if this shadow empire does start to crumble, will the price that all of us have to pay be much, much higher this time around?